Good morning. Thank you all for coming out today. I'm just going to kind of start from a very integral part of my story, and then we'll kind of backtrack from there. So you can see this quote: if you don't find a way to regulate your breathing, you're not going to make it. This is the first thing that I remember when I had my traumatic brain injury and my accident in 2008. I was on the University of Pennsylvania campus, crossing the street in a crosswalk, and I was hit and pinned underneath a truck. I did not lose consciousness until afterwards, so I have a memory of the whole thing until I got in the ambulance. And I had to wait crushed under the truck with all the injuries for another truck to come from an emergency vehicle to, I think there's a special name for it, but I don't know what it is, to lift the truck off of me to put me in an ambulance. So as I'm under there, and of course, very nice bystanders are trying to talk through because I'm obviously very injured. The EMT arrived, but they can't do anything for me until they get this truck off me. And this is what I remember hearing, basically, I'm sure for many of you, when you went through a traumatic experience, you go into shock, and it's very hard to calm yourself down, but it's very important at that moment to do it. So this was the first thing I remember. And not long after this, I was put in an ambulance, lost consciousness, and went to, thankfully, the University of Pennsylvania Trauma Center, which was about a block from where I had my accident at 33rd, 34th, and Walnut Street. And, that's probably one of the reasons I'm still standing here, because I was so close to a level 1 trauma center. So like many of you who are here, I realize how fortunate I am, but obviously it's been a very, very long road from what I'm describing. And as a result of what happened, I had a brain injury. I had a traumatic brain injury, and I will still say I have a traumatic brain injury because, as we know, it's not a recovery per se. You're always living and compensating, and we'll get more into that. But I also had, like I'm sure many of you, very severe other injuries. I had a hemorrhage in my eye. I had facial fractures. I had a collapsed lung. I had 8 broken ribs. I had a crushed right arm, my dominant arm, which they thought I would never use again in the hospital. And as the years progressed after that, I won't get all into the medical details. I had multiple surgeries, like I'm sure many of you had, multiple years of rehab. I had the traumatic brain injury, but then also because I had experienced the whole thing before I lost consciousness, I had PTSD, I had anxiety, I had depression, I had anger. Many of you, I'm sure, can relate to all of this. And of course, in the hospital, in the ICU, you just feel it's some sense of being blessed that you even survived something like that. So, you're medicated, doctors are telling you all kinds of things, family and friends are trying to visit you in the ICU. I didn't really think I was going to have any cognitive or neurological difficulties at that point. I didn't really see it. I was able to talk to people, I recognized them, and I thought that, I don't know why people are telling me I'm going to have all these neurology consults and everything. Like, I think I'm okay. And then after 10 days, I went home. And then I had to start having pen care at home come. And ultimately, I went to Bryn Mawr Rehab. I know I talked to at least one person here from Bryn Mawr Rehab. I don't know if any of my persons I treated with are there, but I went to Bryn Mawr Rehab for, I guess, over a year for cognitive, speech, occupational, physical, and vestibular therapy. And it was really, I think, when I got home from the hospital that I started realizing, in addition to all the limitations I had physically, that things really weren't going to be the same. I realized that I really couldn't listen to people's conversations. When multiple family members were in the room, I was getting very short and angry. I couldn't really follow what they were saying. I couldn't deal with the light in the room. I couldn't express my thoughts. I couldn't find the words that I needed. I couldn't sit and read a magazine or watch a TV show or sit in front of my computer, and I didn't understand why. So of course, gradually, you get to the place where people start to tell you, these are your diagnosis and this is what you have to deal with. And I started with Bryn Mawr Rehab. Let me give the background. So at this point in my life, I am a 34, 35-year-old newlywed. I was a trial lawyer. I did jury trials for a living. So I was in a courtroom in front of people on my feet doing jury trials and hearings and arbitrations and depositions and things of that nature. And so I went from doing that to being at Bryn Mawr Rehab. And like many of you, things happen all of a sudden. This is what life is. So I am there and I start the cognitive and speech therapy. And that is really when I realized we're at a whole other level. People tell you then, and I think I have one of the slides that say this, you have a high functioning disability. And I remember being very angry hearing that term. On the one hand, I know that's fortunate. There are people that have much more serious, right? But at the same time, I want to go back to being a lawyer. And they're telling me I have a high functioning disability and being in a courtroom is not going to be a possibility for me. So when I start to go to Bryn Mawr Rehab, I really am having a crisis of consciousness. At this point, I'm already in therapy, psychologist, psychiatrist, trauma specialist, all of that. And my therapist asked me how I would describe myself. And I told her I'm a litigator. I'm a trial lawyer. That's how I would describe myself. Because like many of you, before this happened, I'm sure that you would describe yourself as what you do. I'm a teacher, I'm a nurse, I'm a doctor, I'm an engineer, I'm an assistant. We describe ourselves as our job. Our job is very meaningful to us. It's our life, right? It's our livelihood. So I said, I'm a litigator. And she said, that's what you do. That's not who you are. Tell me who you are. What are your values? What's meaningful to you? What are you passionate about? What is going to be important to you going forward? You need to start rethinking some of this. And of course, at that point, I really didn't want to rethink any of it. I just wanted my regular life back. So I started my therapies at Bryn Mawr Rehab, all the therapies that I mentioned. And the cognitive and speech, I think, were the most eye-opening for me as far as the traumatic brain injury, because they started giving me pictures. And to me, it was the kind of pictures you would get in elementary school. We're going to show you this picture, and it would be a neighborhood with people and things going on, and dogs, and bicycles, and they would give you a certain amount of seconds to look at it, and then they take it away and say, "What do you remember for the picture?" And in my mind, I would know there was like 30 things going on in this picture, but when it came to remembering what was in the picture, I would say, I don't know. There was a person on the street and a dog, and I think there was a house. And then it really started occurring to me that this is going to be a lot more problematic than I realized, because I knew enough to know that there was a lot more going on in that picture than I was telling her, but I couldn't remember any of it. I didn't notice the backpack, right? They would start to point things out to me. Well, didn't you notice that, the person walking on the street was a student and he had a backpack? No, I didn't notice that. And then you get upset and angry. So I started going through that. And even though I saw that I wasn't at the level where I could even remember things like that, I started arguing with my therapist there. I said, I'm a lawyer and I need to get back to a courtroom. So it's not going to help me to remember if Tom had a backpack on the street in the picture. I need to be able to understand and read like legal briefs and legal cases. So what are you going to do about that? And I think, if I'm just guessing, this is my thought looking back and having some perspective on the situation. I think they probably thought I was insane to think that I should do something on a higher level when I couldn't even remember what was in the pictures. But they indulged me and they gave me, case briefs and things like that from, law reporter books. And sure enough, I had no understanding of it. Couldn't give the main point, couldn't give the issues of the case, couldn't give anything. And it was very clear to me this was going to be a much longer road than I had realized. Sitting in therapy for months, realizing that I couldn't think of the antonyms and synonyms to words that I knew, that I couldn't express things I wanted to express. Even in a room like this with light and some people walking in and out and different things going on, it was like too much for me to handle, and it took too much energy. So it was really, really eye-opening what a long road it was going to be. And then I think what's also really hard about having a brain injury, a traumatic brain injury, is that it's an unseen injury sometimes, right? So you sometimes look okay, right? And maybe you can talk to people and have somewhat of a conversation. Maybe you can't. Maybe you have some days that are good and some days that are not as good. But it's an unseen injury for most of the time. And so people don't really understand that. It's very hard for people to understand an unseen injury. So these are some of the things that were like, I really struggled with, some situations I had. And probably, I don't know if everybody can read this. I'll just read them quickly. I won't go over everyone. You look okay to me. You can have this conversation, so why can't you go to court? The TV is not that loud. Why does it bother you so much? How can you just walk out of my cousin's 40th birthday party? It's rude. Don't you remember who I am? Why didn't you say hello? So these are just some of the things I remember from that time period. Of course, there were many more. I think the one that sticks with me the most is that you can have a conversation, so why can't you go to court? Because at some point during the journey I'm telling you about, and I want to get to the good stuff, so I don't want to go too much more into it. Some point during that journey, I decided it was a good idea for me to try to go back to work part-time. And even though I wasn't allowed to go back to court and I couldn't do any of the things I was doing before, I just thought, I'm so depressed. I miss my work family. Maybe if I have some kind of routine that doesn't feel so isolating and has some normalcy of my old life, I will get better. So I went back to work part-time at a desk job at my law firm, and I became even more angry and depressed and not functioning because of all the other things I had going on and rehab and surgeries. And I just remember there was an attorney at my firm, a lovely woman. She's not a bad person, but people just don't understand. And that's what she said to me. Because at that point, I still had a big caseload and people had to cover all my court appearances. So it was a small office, and people would have to cover my arbitration, cover a trial, cover a hearing. And I guess she just got sick of it, which totally is understandable. And she came into my office and she said, well, you and I are having a conversation. If you can talk to me, why can't you go to court? So that's something that really stuck with me because people just don't understand, right? We understand because in the room where people have gone through this and caregivers and treatment facilitators, but most people do not get it. So it's very hard. Lowest day. This is the last part of my negativity. I mentioned I was treating at Bryn Mawr Rehab, and one day after I couldn't understand all that legal stuff, I just flipped out. I flipped out, right? And to be honest, some of you that have been at facilities, most of you I'm sure have been at facilities, it's not necessarily something that you don't see. People are very upset and angry with the lack of control of lives and everything we're all going through. So it's not that I'd never seen that, but it was a pretty bad freak out. And I really just kind of had a whole meltdown, like a temper tantrum in the middle of the facility. And I remember how nice my therapists were. And there was this beautiful outside area at Bryn Mawr Rehab that was very serene, where I would go when I needed quiet time. And they're like, maybe you should go sit outside for a while. Maybe this is it for today. And I just remember sitting out there and thinking something has to give. I can't go on like this. And I'm going to have to in some way accept where I am, which is very, very hard, even with all the help. And in some way, I'm going to have to figure out how do I move on from this, because there are lots of people in life that something happens to them and that's kind of it. That's what defines them. And all I knew was that was not me. That's, I just didn't have that attitude. It's not who I am. So as much as I was broken down, I knew that I had to go somewhere from there. And, I think sometimes you have to hit the lowest point to realize, what's working for you, what's not working for you. If you rage against the machine and freak out, is that really helping anything? And it really wasn't. So that was my lowest point. And I think after that, I really kind of did some soul searching, and I realized that I'm going to have to accept some of these terms that people are telling me about a high functioning disability and the new normal. And I'm going to have to learn some real compensation strategies. I'm not saying that just this one day it was all rainbows and things got turned around, because it's definitely been a journey and it still is. But I think for me, this was the point that I realized this is not minor. This is going to be a very long journey. So you have to let go, right? I had a great life before I had my accident. As I said, I was a newlywed. We had bought our first house. I was a successful lawyer. I was involved. I was social. I was on boards. I had lots of friends. And after the accident, I was none of those things. It's not just that I couldn't go back to my profession. My husband and I were struggling because we were a newly married couple, and suddenly, I had all this going on, and couldn't get dressed on my own, couldn't drive, all the things that you wouldn't expect as somebody in their 30s to have to go through. And then, I'm sure like many of you, you have a lot of family and friends that doesn't know how to deal with the situation. Some people stand by you. Some of the people that you don't expect will be around are around, and vice versa. There are people that you expect to really work through things with you that are no longer in my life. And even some close family sometimes really don't have an understanding of how to move forward with you. And it's a very, very tough time. So you really have to let go of all of that and think about how are you going to change things for the better for yourself. I had wonderful, wonderful doctors in treatment for many years, surgeries, all of it. Everybody was fantastic. But there really was some part of me that realized that I have to choose for myself to make changes. Nobody else can make me happy. Nobody can rebuild my life. People around me can help, but nobody can do it except me. So that was also a big realization. So throughout this journey, many people said you really need to reconsider a career that involves public speaking, because obviously going to court and doing trials, things like that, that's public speaking. You're on your feet, you're in front of people. You really need to reconsider this. Nobody's saying you could never do it again, but it's going to be very difficult. Are there other things you want to consider? What else do you want to do with your life? And I am very stubborn. I think that has actually really helped me in my journey. Because being told to reconsider and that I can't do something, that was just like impetus for me. Even in the dark place I was in, even with all the, psychologists and everything, that was really an impetus for me, because I don't like to be told you're not going to be able to do something. And like I said, for me, that was what I loved. The only reason I went to law school was to go into court. And so if something wasn't going to involve being in front of people and public speaking, I really didn't want any part of it. I didn't want to hear about what else I could do or should be doing. This is what I wanted to do. So my idol, I would say, is Serena Williams. I don't know if we have any tennis fans in here, but maybe even if you're not a tennis fan, yes. Even if you're not a tennis fan, maybe you know who she is. She's a very, if you don't, she's a very famous tennis player who retired a few years ago. She has a sister who's also a very famous tennis player, but she is an amazing spirit, humanitarian. She has a real fighter attitude. She was very exciting to watch on the court. Sometimes she had the kind of outbursts that I was talking about having at my rehab. And, I remember a particular one where she told a referee on the court, if you don't, change this call or something to that nature, I'm going to stick this ball down your throat. And I'm not saying I encourage that, but I admired the fighting spirit, because I have that fighting spirit. So she's somebody that I've always and still admire. And she was somebody I really looked at, because as she got quote unquote older, because I guess when you get in your 30s, they consider that old for tennis. Literally every interview at every tennis championship, you would have all these reporters who would say things to her like, so when are you going to retire? Isn't 36 enough, or isn't this age enough? And she was still playing at the top of her game, winning tournaments, getting to finals, getting to semifinals. But all anybody seemed to focus on was, you're so old for the sport. When are you going to stop this? And, the way that she came back at them, and sometimes with grace, sometimes just with, a lot of bluster, which I enjoy. She was somebody that I've always looked up to. So I really started thinking a lot about, what do I want my life to look at? I have to regain that fighting spirit that I had as a trial lawyer and kind of get my life back on track. So of course, as I've already mentioned, that started with getting help. I think one of the things for me that was hard is that I felt that this is something I should be able to manage on my own. Certainly not the physical injuries and the surgeries, but why can't I just kind of get it together? Like, why is it so hard for me to get up and brush my teeth and get dressed and do basic stuff? Like, why can't I have conversations? Why can't I be in a space with noise? Like, why can't I manage this on my own? So getting help was super important. I started seeing a psychologist, I think the week I got out of the hospital, and continued for 6 years, and various other providers and things. And I definitely attribute that to a lot of where I am today. But it's really important to recognize that it's not necessarily stuff that you can solve on your own. Even if at that point, you were accomplished and independent and you think that it's something that logically you should be able to solve on your own. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. So it's really that realization that you're going to need good people around you. Find something that brings you joy. So for me, I have never been an athlete, skinny, I've never been like super into fitness and things like that. But, I know how important exercise is. And I was definitely one of those people who sometimes was a big exercise person. I say sometimes because I don't know if anyone can relate. I'd be the kind of person who'd be very dedicated, go to the gym for 6 months or a year, and then I'd fall off and maybe not go for a year. So, can anyone relate? So at that time, yes. So at that time, not only was I very out of shape compared to how I usually was, but again, I was depressed. I was trying to build up endurance. I had a lot of surgeries and physical problems, PT, everything I was going through. And pretty much everything that I tried that I did before, basic stuff like treadmill and ellipticals and things like that, caused me problems with my balance and, my head and with other things. So I really wasn't finding something that I could do that was easy for me and would still be something that gave me movement and kind of helped my mental state at that point. So I actually started hosting a local TV show in the Lower Merion area. And one of the guests that came on was a woman who ran a boxing facility with her husband. And I gave her the interview, and I'm looking at her, and she's thin and fit and young and pretty, and like she's like, you should really come try this boxing. And I'm looking at her thinking, why would I come try this boxing? But I guess I just hit a really low point, right? So at some point, not right after that interview, but months later, I had tried so many things. I was going to PT, and I felt like everything in my body was struggling. And I thought, why not? Right? What do I lose? So I went to her and her husband's facility, and I ended up becoming an avid boxer. That was something that really helped me through this. Now, for some of you, maybe that's not a possibility. I know that that can be an intense thing, but for me, this was a class. They had like a heavy bag, speed bag, double leg bag. I did mitt work with my instructor. For me, this really changed my life. It changed my confidence. It changed the fact that I wasn't moving anywhere. It gave me a sense of accomplishment. And interestingly, it actually really helped my neurological symptoms because there was a tangible way I could see improvement. So when I started with boxing, they would give me the combinations, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and I wouldn't remember them. And I wouldn't be able to do them. But as I progressed there, I remembered all of them and I was able to do them. And I was one of the best people there. Even though I was one of the oldest and probably the most out of shape, I still was one of the best people there. So I find something that brings you joy. If it involves movement, all the better. But just find something that brings you joy, even if it's something that you never tried before the injury you had. It's so important. And, try anything, right? I never thought, if you would have told me before the accident, I'd end up becoming somebody who boxes. I'm like, not me. But here we are. So find something that brings you joy. Find purpose. So before my accident, I was really involved with nonprofit causes, and I was really meaningful work for me. And then, of course, after I had the accident, I gave all of that up. So I would say before I even started trying to work or anything again, I went back to doing some volunteer work. And that was even hard at the time. I remember I volunteered for this NANA organization, which some of you may be familiar with in Philly, where they provide meals to people that are homebound or sick. And they had an event near me, and I thought I'll come volunteer. And I remember they put me in charge of money. And in general, I'm not great with numbers, but certainly after the accident, this was not the thing to put me in charge of. But instead of speaking up and telling them maybe, this is what's going on with me and maybe put me in charge of something else, I didn't want to do that because I was embarrassed. So I said, yes, of course, I'll take care of the money. And at the end of the night, I had messed up all the money. So I felt terrible. And of course, they understood. But still, even with that story, I think it's really important to kind of get back into the world. It's not going to be easy at first. I mean, I remember after that thinking, oh, I can't do this. I don't know why I thought I could even come volunteer. But I went back and I did something else. And eventually it wasn't as hard. And also I felt more comfortable telling people, what my limitations were, what I could do or what I couldn't do, because I wasn't always comfortable with that. So find something with purpose. If that's volunteer stuff, great. If it's something else, better. Lean on your network. So one of the topics I talk about all the time now is strategic networking, communications. And it's really important to me because ultimately I ended up starting a business, first doing consulting because I wasn't well enough to do public speaking and everyone was telling me not to, and ultimately growing it into mainly a public speaking business, which is what I do today. And I teach people about networking. I think the reason it's so passionate for me is because I was in such a dark place after my brain injury and my accident. I was home. So I really didn't return calls at that point. If people came to see me, great. Sometimes I would see them, sometimes I wouldn't. I really isolated myself. I was like, not like myself at all. And I really think that looking back, it was a big mistake. And I wish I had leaned on my network more because things that have happened since then, I really, really appreciate having that support around me. And I did, I was lucky enough to have those people around me, but I was also pushing a lot of people away. And it is really hard. So, for me, it's also the way I grew my business very organically, just kind of going out and sharing my story. Like, I'm changing careers. This is what happened to me. I'm trying to get clients and grow a business. And I just grew it very organically. So I've seen the value professionally and personally of having a network around you, and it's something I'm really passionate about. This particular picture, this was actually the beginning of COVID. And I feel like in some ways, I was prepared for COVID more than probably a lot of people, not people in this room, but general people who haven't been through some of the things we've been through. Because I had been in so many situations where I was home by myself and isolated and recovering from surgeries for many years. So on the one hand, I was more well suited for, what everybody else was struggling with. On the other hand, it was a big trigger for me to be home again and be isolated again. Now, of course, I was going through it with the rest of the world, so that made it easier. But this particular picture, Hallmark actually did something really cool when COVID first started. And they said, we know everybody's isolated. You can go to our website and fill out this form, and we'll send you free cards to share with your network so that you can communicate with people. So these were the cards they sent me. And I thought it was such a cute idea. I'm very big on sending cards, thank you cards, just cards, when people are going through stuff. So I kind of loved that they did this. I thought it was a really nice idea, nice way for people to communicate. And a lot of people aren't about kind of the cards and handwritten notes. So I just thought it was like a nice way to get people involved in something that would connect them at that time when we couldn't connect in a lot of ways. Find tangible ways to see your progress. So I've already mentioned the boxing, but Jeopardy has been big for me. I've watched Jeopardy since I was little, watched with my parents and everything, and still watch as an adult. And my husband and I love watching it. And shouting out answers at the screen and all of that. But obviously after the accident, first of all, I couldn't watch TV for a while. And then when I could watch something like Jeopardy, it was very challenging and it angered me a lot because I knew there was a lot of things that I should know about different things that I didn't remember the answers of. But over time, I forced myself to keep doing it, and I realized I do know a lot more than I did at that time. So it's one of those tangible ways. I think that can be a real struggle when you have a brain injury because it's not linear and the recovery doesn't just go upward, of how to see your progress. What are some things that you can do in your life? It doesn't have to be Jeopardy or boxing, but what is it that you can do to really see tangible progress? Because it's so important. Because some days you're going to go backwards, you're not going to see it at all. Like, what are the things that you can do to really make it so that you can see that there is some improvement happening? Challenge yourself, right? So I am really big now on just doing crazy new things every year. What can I do? I got a second chance at life. How am I going to spend this? How am I going to make the most of it? So every year I have crazy new challenges. This picture, this was actually the 10-year anniversary of my accident. I celebrate every year as my life day. I'm sure a lot of you do as well. And this was me and some of my girlfriends. We went zip lining, and not something I would ever do. And this was, I think, after my 4th Achilles surgery from the accident. And I knew that it was going to be a struggle for me with my ankle. And I remember being so proud that I did it. Didn't get through all the courses. My ankle was a concern, but still proud that I got out there and did it, and something I would never have done before the accident. So I try to think about those things every year. What is it that I can do to really make me feel like I have created something new? I'm taking on new challenges. I'm doing things that I wouldn't have done because, this happens. Even though something bad happens, there are challenges and good things that can come out of it. And that goes to really my last point, which is recognizing the opportunity. Getting a second chance of life, a lot of people don't have it. You turn on the news every day. I mean, just the story that happened to me, I can't tell you how many days I turn on the news and somebody's walking as a pedestrian and they die right there. Or they're taking an ambulance and they're pronounced dead at a hospital. So I realized how fortunate I am. Of course, it took years and years of help and therapy to get me to a better mental place, but recognizing that really you have so much in front of you that yes, you have to adapt and compensate and find new ways to do things, but I have created a whole new life, a better life than I had before. Even though I had a very nice life when I had my accident, I was really on sort of an autopilot path. I would have just continued to, be a lawyer and do my trials and do whatever I was doing. And I had a nice life and there's nothing wrong with that. But now, years later, after I went through all the stuff and, built the consulting and built this public speaking, now I feel like I'm really making an impact and a difference. And, some of that was learning over time to not be embarrassed to share my story and share a lot of the nitty gritty that maybe a lot of people wouldn't share, and getting more comfortable with that. Because at first, when I started doing public speaking, I wouldn't share any of that. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, these law firms and big companies who are taking a chance on me, they don't know that like that might be a day where I can't actually find some words, or I'll have 5 points to talk about and I'll only remember 3 of them. And that stuff happened. It's not that it didn't happen. And there were definitely times where I went and I was hired to speak, and maybe the audience didn't notice it as much, but I would leave crying and thinking, I don't know why I thought I could do this. I can't tell them. If they knew that I had a brain injury and that I had all this, trauma and everything I was still dealing with, they would never hire somebody like me. I would never be able to do this. But ultimately, I realized that my story had to become part of messaging. And that's been much more rewarding to be able to help people and really be open about it. And I'm really at the point now, after all these years, where if there's places that feel like that's a hindrance or they don't want it, I don't care. Like, you don't have to like me, you don't have to hire me. There's plenty of other places where I can share my message. So I'm very comfortable with it today, but it did take a lot of years to get to that place. So some of the success stories. When I decided I really was going to start sharing my story openly, I decided I wanted to be a TEDx speaker, because I thought, what better way, to really have that platform than to be on the TEDx stage. That's really going to prove to me in my head that I'm back. I can really do public speaking, even if some days it's really a struggle. I'm going to share my story with a bigger audience. So I tried for 5 years to get a TEDx talk, rejection after rejection after rejection. And finally, December of 2019, I got offered a TEDx talk. I had hoped it would be in the Philly area so all my family and friends could come, but it was in Arkansas. And I was like, that's fine. Okay, it's not going to be what I hoped it would look like with all my family and friends there, but a TEDx is a TEDx, right? So I, worked with the coaches, I trained and everything, and then I was supposed to deliver it at the University of Arkansas, March 17th of 2020. So that entire week leading up to the talk, the news is saying there's this virus and people are sick and we don't know what it is. And, I felt like in some ways I was back in the hospital, because I remember one of the things that struck me in the hospital was that my dad and my husband would talk about me in the third person like I wasn't in the room. I was in the ICU. Yes, I was medicated, but I could hear them. She thinks she's going to be able to do this, this, and this. And I'm like, I can hear you and I am going to do it, So I felt like I was back in that place, because that whole week they would just be like, does she think she's going to get on a plane and do this talk? Because she's not going to do this. Like, she can't, her immune system isn't good and she's not going to get on a plane in the middle of this virus. And I said, I am getting on a plane. Like, I've waited 5 years to do this TEDx talk and it's happening. Like, nobody's going to stop me. Of course, then they shut down the country and all the airplanes. So I would have done all of it. But ultimately, I was given a choice by the TEDx organizers at that point. They actually did go on with the TEDx, but only with the people local. The people that were coming from different places in the country who had to fly, nobody could come, including me. So they said, listen, you can wait a year and see where we are. There's no guarantee that you'll be able to do this again. Or you can tape it yourself in an empty studio in Philadelphia with a videographer with all the parameters. And if you do it in the right way, we will get it up on TEDx. So I did that, which was really a struggle, because this is during COVID lockdown, right? This is COVID lockdown. The state of Pennsylvania actually has everything closed. And one of my best friends, and I won't mention names to get her in trouble, she ran a photography, videography studio. She knew my story, my struggle. She knew how important this was to me and how many years I had tried. And she said, listen, we're going to tape it in my studio. So she came, she brought a videographer. We all wore our masks. It was the first time I'd been out of the house for months. I was very nervous, not only to give the talk with like none of what I thought would happen, right? I had this vision. I'm really great at visualization. So I had this vision of like being on the big stage with the audience, with the red logo behind me. As you can see, no red logo, no TED letters, nothing. So taped it in an empty studio. And I have to say, I mean, when we gain perspective on things, it actually happened in exactly the way it should have, looking back, because it got released in, I think, May or June of 2020. And it's all about change and resilience and overcoming challenges and struggle and my story. And it got released at exactly the right time that people needed to hear that message. So even though I had worked for 5 years and I, didn't understand every time I got rejected, it really worked the way it was supposed to. And I think that happens a lot in life. You don't see it at the time, but it does happen. So that's a big success. then I decided I want to start doing media segments on TV. And again, everybody said, isn't it enough that you're trying to do public speaking again when you really, this isn't something that you should have even imagined with your brain injury? And I said, I like TV. I'm going to try to do this. And so now I have done since 2018, I don't even know how many segments for Fox 29, PHL 17, CBS, NBC. I did a national segment for Cheddar News. A bunch of them I did over COVID, which were virtual, which were very hard because you have to manage everything in your own space. So again, this was something that really I shouldn't be here talking about doing. And here I am doing it. I decided this was a goal, and now I'm doing TV segments. I started teaching at Wharton. So this is probably the most meaningful thing, because if you remember from the beginning, I mentioned having my accident on the University of Pennsylvania campus. So because it happened on the campus, because I was conscious for it, I actually had very severe PTSD that I treated for and couldn't cross any streets. So at the time when my accident happened, my sister was living a few blocks from my accident scene at 31st and Walnut. And I would have to get in a cab because there was no Uber or Lyft at that time. I would have to get in a cab 3 blocks because I couldn't cross the street where my accident was. So now I'm interviewing for a position to teach on the campus where I had the accident. So of course I thought they're never going to pick me. I'm not going to be teaching business communication. Like, who am I to do that? I shouldn't even be doing public speaking anymore. I have a brain injury. And I went through a very grueling process. And now this is my 3rd year teaching business communication at Wharton. Literally walking by my accident scene every day that I had. So for me, this is the most full circle moment to be able to not only be teaching communication skills, but doing it at the place where I couldn't even cross the street when this happened. So this was probably my biggest win. And so what's next? I am finishing. I'm hoping to have the QR code for pre-order next week. I'm doing a book, Lucky, on my story, and hoping to help people really see that you can create a new life. But I really want to just not harp on this, because this is really what I want the message to be. If there's one thing you take away from this, I sat at dinner with a few people from the conference last night, and I was sharing with them that we're 16 years later out from my accident. And it may seem like, look, she's had all this success and she's doing well. It has been a struggle. It's still a struggle every day. Is it a struggle in the same way it was, 16 years ago? No. But, just this week, I had an argument with my husband because he has the TV too loud in the house, and I need my quiet morning time to be able to do some of these things that I talk about doing now. And he doesn't get it. He's wonderful, and he helped me through many, many years of things, but I just don't understand why your whole day is going to be impacted by a loud TV in the morning. It's just not that big a deal. Like, why would it throw off your whole day like that? But it still will. And, earlier this week, I was supposed to go to this conference I really wanted to go to in New York on Tuesday, but I knew that was going to be such a full day for me. And I had a lot of other work commitments, and I had to skip the conference because I knew if I spent the day in New York, I would need probably a day or two to recover from doing that. And I just didn't have the day or two to recover. So it's still making those choices. It's finding ways around it, finding ways to adapt and compensate and change in ways I don't want to. I want to be able to do all the things all the time, but just still being able to do what I need to do and reach my goals and create a new life, but doing it in a way that makes sense for what I'm still dealing with. And that definitely continues. That hasn't gone away. So that's really the message I want to leave everyone with. I know many people in the room are at different stages of their treatment, and I can't tell you how many times I've gone backwards. But you still, ultimately, you never stay at that place. People always tell you when you get to that place, once you hit ground zero, there's nowhere to go but up, right? And it is a cliche, but it's also true. So I really feel strongly that wherever you are in your journey, or those of you that are helping people, it's just so important to keep your mindset right. Do whatever you can with help to get your mindset in the right place. That is really the biggest eye-opening moment for me, I would say, is just to realize that my mindset shift was really the thing more than surgeries and doctors and recovery and therapists. It was really the mindset shift that changed my life and kind of brought me, where I am talking to you all today. So thank you so much. This is my information. I have a little extra time before we talk about Q&A. So I thought I'll share something I actually forgot to put on the slide, which is probably the funniest success story I've had since I had the accident. I talked about doing new challenges every year, and sometimes they're crazy and out of the box. And I realized I forgot to put the slide, which would have been the most fun slide. I decided to enter a pageant, and I decided at age 49 to enter a pageant called Mrs. Classic Universe. And the idea behind the pageant, 40% of the pageant is based on your story and your platform, and the rest of it is what you would think of as a traditional pageant. So we're talking runway, evening gown, resort wear, bathing suits, we didn't have town actually, but we did have a dance number. So, I don't know why I decided for this, a friend of mine who is actually also on a speaking circuit in Philadelphia and has actually been through some different kinds of struggles and it is amazing. She had done the pageant and she's like, I know you, I know your story. I really think you should do it. And I was like, okay, why not? And then I got to the pageant. I made it to the finals. I represented Pennsylvania, made it to the finals in Vegas, and then really kind of like lost all my confidence. And some of the things I'm talking about today, I think is really what kept me there because, I really was ready to pack up and leave. I saw all these other women and I was like, what was I thinking? They all had expensive pageant coaches and $10,000 gowns. And I was just like, okay, I'm going to go do this pageant. So, for me, it was just kind of one of those crazy challenges. Anyway, I say all of this to say, I ended up winning the world title. So it was actually a great, like I said, I'm sorry I forgot the slide. It was a great success story because it got me not only to a place where I thought, wow, I took on this crazy new challenge and I accomplished it just like these other things I'm talking about, but it also gave me such a larger platform. I really spent my year talking a lot about my brain injury, working with some brain injury organizations, working with some mental health organizations, really highlighting a lot of things that were important to me. So it was an amazing year, that I had before I gave my crown and turned it over to the next queen. But something that, again, if you had told me when I was a lawyer, you're going to enter this pageant, I was like, not me, But I think, the more that you can look at your life and think about creative ways that you can really feel like I'm living and I'm changing the world and I'm changing myself for the better, I think the happier that you're going to be no matter what stage you're at in your journey. So with that, thank you, and I'll open it for questions. I think they're going to come around with a microphone.
How how old were you when you had your injury?
So I was 35.
35?
Yes.
How did you have your injury?
I was on the University of Pennsylvania campus, and I was a pedestrian in a crosswalk, and I got hit and pinned underneath a truck.
Okay, thank you.
I was super impressed by the fact that you can walk by the site of your accident. Can you speak about the empowerment of that?
It's really hard to put in words. I can't tell you how many years. Not only could I not cross that street, I couldn't cross any streets. Sometimes if somebody walked with me and literally led me across the street, I could, but if I was by myself, I remember 2012, which was 4 years after my accident, my husband was in an MBA program at Temple. And as part of the end of their program, they were going to Asia, and I had a chance to go with them. And I'd never been out of the country. And he said, you have to go. And I was thinking, I was still kind of in the middle of rehab and surgeries and things like that. Well enough to go, but still dealing with a lot of stuff. And I thought, I can't go to Asia. Like, I've never been out of the country. Now I'm going to go on this 24-hour trip. Of course, it ended up being like one of the highlights of my life. But I mention it because the first country we went to was Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. And I don't know if any of you are familiar or you've been there, but they have a very condensed population in Ho Chi Minh, and they also ride on these scooters, these very fast scooters that go in circles. So there's none of this, like, you wait to cross the street and, there's a pedestrian walk. And you're literally dodging scooters to try to get across the street. And I was panicked because he's in all these seminars and I want to see the country, and I realized that the only way I'm going to be able to do it is to get through these scooters and cross the street. So, I mean, I've definitely had a lot of moments where it's been very challenging, but I think, to your point, that was the one. When I started interviewing for Wharton, I kind of had to mentally face, do I actually even want to get this? Because if I get it, I'm going to be on this campus every week and I'm going to have to cross the same intersection where this happens. But it is such a full circle moment. I kind of feel like I want to do a photo shoot there at some point.
Do it. Do it.
Intersection. But yeah, it's definitely life changing.
Jennifer, your story is amazing and inspiring.
Thank you.
And you shared a little bit with me before we started today about when you had your injury, you found the place where you lived was inaccessible in many ways. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. And by the way, this is a commercial for our workshop at 1 o'clock C3.
I love it. Yes, at the time that this accident happened, my husband and I were living, we had bought our first house in a local community here, if you're familiar with the area, called Chesterbrook. And it's a lovely townhouse community, but it's also, there's sidewalk within your little courtyard. And once you get out of there, you're on major roads. And there was no Uber or Lyft. As I said, this was many years ago. A lot of the options that we have today, we did not have then. So I was very, very isolated. I because of my head injury, I didn't have my license for, I think, about 6 months. And even when I did, it was still a struggle to try to get back to getting in a car, even though I had my accident as a pedestrian. I guess maybe because it involved a truck, I don't know, but the driving was very, very tough for me. So yes, I felt very isolated. I was saying before, my little courtyard where we had maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 townhouses had one of the communal mailboxes that you would walk to with the keys. And for a while, I couldn't even get to there. I would walk around with my therapist and I couldn't make it to the mailbox. And then when I could make it to the mailbox, that was my big outing of the day. I would walk to the mailbox. This was at the time where there was no streaming services. So I would order the Netflix and then it would come and I would go to the mailbox and get my Netflix. And then I'd call my husband and be like, the Netflix came, we can watch it tonight. And that was literally like the highlight of my day because I was so isolated. So, yes.
Can I go? I'm gonna go.
Oh, I guess, yeah.
I just wanted to say, queen is the right word. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your journey. I loved how you talked about networking and your people and your base of support. One of the things that I think survivors sometimes struggle with is meeting new people. So I'm wondering how you network outward and how you connect, not just from your base, but meeting new folks as well. Thank you.
Yes. So I mentioned earlier, at the time that I had the accident, there were people who at some point became no longer part of my life and for various reasons, just like even when you don't have something traumatic happen to you, we know you have people in your life sometimes for a while, maybe there's not necessarily a falling out, but it changes. But because of the accident, all of my friends at that point were really in the legal community, except for maybe some college friends. I was very entrenched in the Philly legal community. And a lot of people didn't know how to deal with it. Some family members didn't know how to deal with it. So I think it actually made it easier for me to meet new people because by the time I started my business, I guess that was about late 2012, around 2013, somewhere around there. Most of the people I was dealing with as an entrepreneur getting out there and trying to get the word out about what I was doing didn't know the pre-accident Jennifer. So that made it a lot easier for me because it was up to me what I wanted to share. A lot of the people that had been in my life before that were no longer in my life, except for some family and close friends. So I think actually for me, that made it easier because it was like what I chose to share with them. And I almost was like creating a new persona where people didn't know the accident Jen. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this has been very inspirational, especially for my wife and I, who are fairly early on in our journey of recovery. I think it's hard for us to see the lights at the end of the tunnel and how we're going to get there. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about at what point you felt there'd been a change or a turn in which you could start to recover some of those higher function abilities, which clearly you have, which is fantastic. So maybe if you could just share a little bit about people that are more early on in the journey and the path to recovery.
Absolutely. I mean, when I decided I was going to be crazy and try to do public speaking, it did not go well for a long time. It did not. I talked to somebody earlier who wants to get into more public speaking, and I was talking about, literally at that point, I would try to go anywhere that would have me for free. So I would talk to public libraries, Rotary clubs, can I come speak? And I feel like that's where I made a lot of my mistakes, and people were very understanding. I don't know, maybe when you're doing things for free, people are more understanding. I don't know, but I feel like there were a lot of mistakes. I do remember, and I want to say this was around 2015, 2016. I did my first big corporate event that I was hired for, and I felt that I really messed up. I don't know how much they realized I messed up, but I had a whole presentation that I wanted to give, and I feel like I gave maybe 60% of it. And I left very flustered and feeling like I really screwed up because there was about 40% of the presentation. I remember I went over to my sister's apartment. I was crying. Why did I think I was going to be able to do this? And then, my husband, who always, I'm much more kind of, let me be reactive and talk about things as I think them. And I think that's actually worse since my accident. But he's very introspective and thoughtful. And he said, if you had 6 points and you only remembered 3, they don't know that. They only heard the 3 points. I'm sure it went way better than you thought. Nobody said anything, right? You know that you forgot the 3 points. You're beating yourself up about it, but nobody else knows that but you. And it really was helpful because there were a lot of times that kind of thing happened. Even now. I mean, I feel like there are times where I get up to speak and it flows. And there are other times where it's not flowing as well, like anything else. I mean, sometimes I come home and I think this was a good day speaking. And other times I'm like, this wasn't one of my best. And I'm sorry for that. I wish it was consistent all the time, but it doesn't stop me from doing it. But it has been, a long, long path. But yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, I literally had years where I didn't get dressed, didn't shower, didn't brush my teeth, didn't leave the house, but fought with my husband every day. He tried to get me to leave the house. I wouldn't leave the house. I just wanted to stay in my dark place. Like I said, wouldn't see people, wouldn't answer calls. Just even basic hygiene, like it just wasn't something I was about. I mean, there's a lot of negativity, path that I didn't go into, but I mean, at some point I was addicted to pain and sleeping pills and I had to work through that. We had a lot of problems with our marriage. I mean, we were a newly married couple, trying to go through all this. He's an only child. The same time we were going through it, his father was dying of cancer. Ultimately, the beginning of 2011, which was only a few years after both of our moms died. So when you talk about compounded trauma, I felt in 2011, a few years out, that I was getting to a better place. I wasn't there, but I was getting to a better place. And I really took a turn at that point, where I went way more downhill than I even was in 2008. So when I say it's not linear, I have walked the walk. I know you all have a long road in front of you, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm just kind of hopefully here to show you that it's not always going to be like this, and you're going to have a lot more good days.
Yeah. Okay. I know. You said Serena Williams was hero of yours. You're my hero. I mean, this is
Make me cry.
like I didn't want. No. I didn't want to be like another person kissing your ass, but like because you're probably tired of that. But you're. I mean, just amazing. Just amazing.
Thank you so much.
Now you were newlywed when your accident happened. How long were you and your husband together or dating or knew each other before you got married?
Oh,
Is that
wow.
definitely
We met as lawyers at my first attorney job, and we were like the last of our friends to get married. I don't think either of us were ready for marriage. So we got engaged in December 2005. We were living together at that point. We bought our first house in 2006 before we got married. That was the house I was in when the accident happened. So by the time the accident happened, we were together almost 8 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, he sounds like he's my hero too. So.
He's amazing. Yeah. I don't tell him enough. Usually I'm,
Yeah.
why
do
didn't you
that
take
more.
the trash out? Why isn't this done? Yeah. I don't tell him enough.
Do that more.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, I took over coordination for my brain injury support group because the woman who was running it respectfully bowed out because family affairs and stuff, and which happens. So I asked if I could continue it. So I did, and we started a podcast for brain injury survivors. It's kind of a fledgling thing because I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
Fine.
And with brain injury and all, it's, you understand. But like, hearing your story, it just, motivates me to like, all right, you know what? It's gonna be hard, but you got this, and you just have to get Jennifer Lynn Robinson to appear on your podcast.
I'm
And
happy to.
that's the answer to the, but thank you so much.
You're so welcome. It will be a struggle, but you are changing so many lives, which is what I think about when I'm having my really bad days. It may sound a little bit egotistical, but I've realized it's not. It's really important to, get messages out there, share your story, share other people's story in rooms like this. It's important, whether it comes across great and you know what you're doing or you don't. It's still important.
Can you say anything about after you hit the bottom, what rejuvenated you? What brought you back?
So as I said, I think, that lowest day I had at speech and cognitive therapy, I think was one of the turning points. I don't want to get too much in the weeds because I know we only have a minute or two left for questions, but part of that journey was my mother. She's passed away. She passed away in 2011. She was an amazing person who had been through a lot in her life, had a PhD that she got when she was 8 months pregnant with my youngest sister, spoke 7 languages. She had amazing things going for her, but she struggled with mental illness. And so for her, when her and my father split up, she took a very bad turn and she let that define her life. So when I had my accident, she really tried to be there for me, but I would get calls from her every day that said things like, "You are so lucky to have survived this. You don't need to do anything else. Just sit on the couch. You're blessed. You're lucky to be here. You don't need to try to do anything else." And to be honest, that was actually an impetus for me. Like, even though she was telling me those words, I was thinking, I have plenty more I want to do. As much as you're an amazing person, you're struggling. I don't want to be you and be defined by one thing in my life. And ultimately, she passed away a few years later. But that was for me. I mean, everybody has different things in their life. For me, that was looking at her and thinking what kind of life she could have had and the kind of life I wanted to have.
We probably have time for one more question. You mentioned something that you progressed and got better and then fell back and got worse. What do you mean in that regard, furthermore?
I mean, I think when you go through many, many surgeries and rehab over a lot of years, in some ways you learn to cope and in other ways it brings you back. So everything can be a new trauma. So if a year or two went by and I didn't have a surgery and then I need to have another surgery, I felt that it took me to the place that I was in initially when I had 10 injuries and all the stuff. I felt isolated. I felt like I was doing better in the sense that I was connecting with more people, but it really did take me backwards and made me remember all the darkest parts of that initial time when I had my accident. So you would think that going through it again and again, you would feel like you got used to it. But for me, it was almost like a re-trauma. And certainly the deaths of our parents and things that I spoke about, that was probably the thing that put me much more back into intense psychological therapy. Because at that point, I was 3 years into therapy and I thought that I was kind of nearing the end of working through my stuff with the accident. And then all that other stuff happened because life happens, right? Nothing happens in isolation. So even though I was going through all this, all kinds of other things happen, and that's how life is. So that really took me way backwards, and I had to really intensify my psychological therapy for almost a year.